This sikha is on Pirkei Avos, Perek Daled, and the Mishnah says, Ben Azai says, have a ratzl mitzvah kala, you should be running to do a minor mitzvah, beireach min ha'aveira, you should be fleeing, running away from doing aveiros, because one mitzvah leads to another mitzvah, mitzvah gereres mitzvah, one aveira leads to another aveira, and then he goes on and says, Shechar mitzvah, schar aveira, as we'll soon see what that means. But the Rebbe says that we know that Pirkei Avos is usually what's called milsa de chasidusa, telling us ways of going beyond the letter of the law, for someone that's a chassid, someone that's pious. And seemingly this idea of running to a mitzvah is something that's not milsa de chasidusa. This is a clear halacha. It's in fact brought in Shulchan Aruch that mitzvah, it's a mitzvah to run to shul, v'chein l'chol dvar mitzvah, and so too for every other mitzvah. The Rebbe says another thing we need to understand is why does Ben Azai not say that you should be running to do a mitzvah, kala kid, just like a bigger mitzvah, similar to what we had a Mishnah earlier on in Pirkei Avos when it speaks about how careful we should be doing mitzvahs. It said, have a zohar b'mitzvah kala kid v'chamura, which seems to be telling us that in fact the way we run to mitzvahs is not going to be exactly the same in different kinds of mitzvahs. We do differentiate between a mitzvah kala and another mitzvah. Because for a mitzvah kala, you're going to be running in one way, and obviously for a bigger mitzvah, you're going to be running in a greater way. But if that's the case, says the Rebbe, why did Ben Azai even have to say to run to a mitzvah kala? Why does he have to emphasize kala? Just say simply run to every mitzvah, and we understand that depending on the mitzvah is also going to depend exactly how we're running to do that mitzvah. Now, as far as the reason for the running, as we just quoted, there was two things. Mitzvah gereres mitzvah, one mitzvah leads to the other, and aveira leads to another aveira. And then he says, Shechar mitzvah, the reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah, the reward of an aveira, the punishment for an aveira is an aveira. Now, what's the difference between these two reasons? The first reason, mitzvah gereres mitzvah, is telling us of why we should be even running for a simple mitzvah. Because, yes, it's a simple mitzvah, a light mitzvah, but it's going to lead us to do other mitzvahs. The second reason is coming along and telling us that no, we should be running even from the perspective of this mitzvah itself. Shechar mitzvah. What does schar mitzvah mean? So the Rebbe brings, first of all, the pirush of the Rav, that it means, schar means the enjoyment of the mitzvah, the enthusiasm you have in the mitzvah, which is expressed in the running to do the mitzvah. You know what says the Rav? That itself is a mitzvah. Schar mitzvah, that enthusiasm, that running itself is a mitzvah. Another pirush that Chassidus brings is the idea that the reward of the mitzvah is the tzav savachim, or the connection to Hashem. But says the Rebbe, if that's the case, the main reason then should be because of schar mitzvah. In other words, it's relevant to this mitzvah itself, the running of this mitzvah itself. That should have been the first reason. We could then add another point that it's also going to help us get to other mitzvahs. The Rebbe says there's another place in Pirkei Avos where we also speak about this idea of running in our avodas Hashem. Famously, Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema tells us to be emulating and using the characteristics and qualities of different animals. And he says we should be running like a deer to do the will of Hashem in heaven, of our Father in heaven. This is actually brought in the Tur, and the Alter Rebbe brings it as well, in the very, very beginning of Shulchan Aruch and the beginning of Orach Chaim. Says the Rebbe, from all of this we see that there's actually three levels or three ideas in running in our avodas Hashem. There is the one that we mentioned before, that it says in Shulchan Aruch is a mitzvah to run to shul, and then we add v'chein l'chol dvar mitzvah, and so too to all other mitzvahs. So this is an obligation in Shulchan Aruch. There is the running, what says in Pirkei Avos that Yehuda ben Tema says, run to do ritzoyin avicha shebashamayim. Now this is considered milsa de chasidusa, something that the pious do. It's not an absolute obligation in Shulchan Aruch, but it is brought in Shulchan Aruch, which tells us this is something also that's applicable to every single person. And then finally, there's the Hayra of Ben Azai that tells us run to the minor mitzvahs, which is considered a midas chassidus that's not necessarily equally applied to all people, and that's why it's only in Pirkei Avos and not brought in Shulchan Aruch. And the chiddush of this type of running is specifically emphasized because we say that word mitzvah kala, as we will see later. Says the Rebbe, in order to understand all of this, the general idea of enthusiasm in fulfilling the Eibishter's Ratzon and running to do the Eibishter's Ratzon obviously shows on a tremendous simcha. We're excited to do what Hashem wants, to cause Hashem nachas ruach. When we're running, it shows that this simcha, this chayis, is going beyond our limitations. And that's why we're trying to do it as quickly as possible. The Rebbe says this sort of attitude comes really from a level of bittul, of absolute nullification to Hashem. Because when a person feels himself very much, So yes, he could do a mitzvah with simcha, but it's still going to be with some sort of limitation. He's not going out of his kelim, not going beyond himself, losing himself completely. Where when a person is completely bottle, so then he could reach the simcha of going bligvul, as a result of which he runs. The Rebbe brings famously as David HaMelech was dancing and jumping because of his simcha in avodas Hashem, as a result of his humility. Says the Rebbe, this will actually explain to us also something that the Alter Rebbe says in regards to running to shul and all other mitzvahs. He says, the pasuk says, "Nir defol adas as Hashem," we will run for the knowledge of Hashem. Now the question is, the Alter Rebbe does usually bring reasons in Shulchan Aruch for the halachas, but he usually doesn't necessarily bring the psukim from where we learn it out. So why is the Alter Rebbe bringing this pasuk over here? Furthermore, it sounds from the Alter Rebbe that we're learning out both things from the pasuk, running to shul and other mitzvahs. But actually in the Gemara, this pasuk is brought only about running to shul. Regarding other mitzvahs, there's another pasuk that's brought. So the Rebbe says that the Alter Rebbe is bringing this pasuk not as a source, but rather as a reason for the running. How do we understand this? On this pasuk, the pasuk actually starts, "V'neida," we will know, "Nir defol adas es Hashem," we will run to know Hashem. The Tzemach Tzedek says this double expression of das, neida, and first starts v'neida and then it says ladas, represents what's known as two levels of das elyon and das tachton, two ways of our connection and appreciation for Elikus. Das elyon is usually the approach and the perspective that Hashem is the absolute only reality. There is nothing besides for Hashem. Das tachton is that there is a world and that Hashem is, of course, giving life to the world and so on. Says the Tzemach Tzedek that nirdeful adas Hashem is telling us that where does this idea of nirdeful, of running with this bleak vul come from? It only comes from the das elyon. When we have this appreciation that Hashem is the only reality, that's what gets us in the mode of ratzui, of running towards Hashem in an unlimited way, just wanting to become close to Hashem, one with Hashem, as opposed to das tachtoin, where then there's still much of our mitzvahs, and therefore our approach to Hashem is going to be more in a step-by-step going, not in the way of bligvul. Now, even though this is a very, very high level, that our running to Hashem should be coming from this level of das elyon, nevertheless, the actual obligation to running to shul, simply with our feet, this is something that is shaykh to every single person doing the act. Now, even though we might not be holding by the inner reason for that running, of this great, great bittul, but by customizing ourselves, by getting ourselves used to in the habit of running with simcha to shul and to other mitzvahs, that itself will help us to get to this high level of ladas as Hashem to das elyon. Says the Rebbe, this is what the Alter Rebbe is saying as a reason. Why are we running near default? Ladas as Hashem, in order to come to knowing Hashem. That's the reason for the running. That's going to help us reach this high level in knowledge of Hashem and complete bittul to Hashem. Says the Rebbe, now we can also understand why it's brought primarily regarding davening, but we're also including other mitzvahs. Because running to shul, running to davening, this is the main time when we are gaining our knowledge, our connection to Hashem, our growth in our avodas Hashem, our attachment to Hashem. But this will also help us later to have this attitude also in other mitzvahs. So this is the running that Shulchan Aruch discusses and has obligation. Now we come to Pirkei Avos and two levels. Because Pirkei Avos is going to add something more. We're speaking about the inner idea of what the running is all about. That simcha, that zrizus and avodas Hashem. So here we're going to have two levels. One is what Yehuda ben Tema tells us. You should be running like a deer. And this is going to be something that's more shaykh to everyone, and that's why it's brought in Shulchan Aruch as well. Then there is the idea of having a ratzl mitzvah kala, which Ben Azai says. So Yehuda ben Tema is speaking about we're not speaking about individual mitzvahs. We're speaking about the general dedication to connect to Hashem throughout the day. This is something we do in the beginning of the day. Even before Maidani, in fact. We're waking up, it's brought in Shulchan Aruch, it's brought number one, even before speaking about Maidani. It's brought the first thing. In other words, the first approach is waking up with that attitude, I want to do what Hashem wants. Now this is shaykh to every single person. Similar to what we say, Moidani is shaykh to every person, even if a person didn't wash Negelvasi yet, his hands are still tamei and so on. Then comes Ben Azai and adds something even more. Have a ratzla mitzvah kala. Now when you say mitzvah kala, that means we are differentiating between mitzvahs already. We're not speaking about just a general attitude in the beginning of the day. We're starting to look already at the details of the mitzvah, each mitzvah, what it symbolizes, what it represents. Here Ben Azai is telling us a chiddush, even in that aspect of the mitzvah, we should be doing it with a simcha bli gvul. Now this all fits actually with Ben Azai's approach. Generally we know that Ben Azai, he didn't marry. Ben Azai was one of the people in the Pardes that he just went out, he expired with great love to Hashem, the avodah of Ratzui. That means because he feels in every single detail of avodah this tremendous connection and longing and oneness with Hashem. Now says the Rebbe, and we're now going to also come to understand the 2 points that Ben Azai says about schar mitzvah, mitzvah gereres mitzvah, and schar mitzvah. Because in this idea of appreciating the beauty, the geschmack, that enjoyment and becoming one with Hashem in a mitzvah, there's 2 ideas. One is because of the preciousness of the mitzvah itself. The other is because kirvas alikim litoy, because it makes me, the yid, feel closer to Hashem. Says Rebbe, this is the 2 points that Ben Azai says regarding running to a mitzvah, and specifically in this order. The main point he says is because of the preciousness of the mitzvah itself. Mitzvah geireres mitzvah, the Rebbe is translating now, because your mitzvah is going to bring with it a mitzvah, meaning a connection to Hashem. That's the number one. In other words, it's all about Hashem. It's not even about myself at all. It's not how I feel about it. It's just about Hashem. But since not everyone's holding by this level, so therefore we also say the concept of schar mitzvah mitzvah. What does schar mitzvah mitzvah mean? In other words, that even where I feel that there's a concept of schar, even where I feel there's an idea of what's in it for me, the reward. But you know what? Even that is the idea of tzavsa v'chibur. In other words, the person feels that the closeness with Hashem is also what he's going to appreciate, and that itself also in a way of bli gvul.